The cargo freighter landed on Station Meridian 7 with a loud hiss of steam and the grinding of old metal. And Commander Sarah Voss watched it from her post near the docking bay entrance, her hand resting on the energy pistol at her hip. She had been a guard on this station for 6 years now, and she knew trouble when she saw it. And today trouble walked off that freighter in the form of a man with no name and no past. He was tall and thin, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders in messy tangles. And he wore clothes that looked like they had been stitched together from a dozen different sources. And his boots were held together with wire and tape. And everything about him screamed vagrant or refugee or worse, but it was his eyes that caught her attention first. They were gray like storm clouds, and they moved across the docking bay with a precision that did not match his ragged appearance. And she watched him track every security camera, every guard position, every exit. And she knew in her gut that this man was dangerous. Sarah stepped forward and raised her hand to stop him. "Iden Chip," she said, keeping her voice flat and professional. The man stopped walking and looked at her. And for a moment, something strange passed across his face. Something that looked almost like recognition. But then it was gone and his expression became empty again. "I do not have one," he said. And his voice was deep and calm. "Everyone has an Iden chip," Sarah replied. And she pulled out her scanner and waved it near his wrist, and the device beeped red, confirming what he had said. No signal, no data, no identity. In the years since the Arzelian conquest had destroyed humanity's golden age, people without ident chips had become common, and they were called ghosts because they did not exist in any system. And ghosts were usually refugees who had lost everything, or criminals who had erased their past, or spies who had never existed at all. "You are coming with me," Sarah said. And she reached for her restraints. The man did not resist, and that surprised her, because men who tracked security cameras like predators usually did not go quietly. But he simply held out his wrists and let her bind them. And he watched her face the entire time with those gray storm cloud eyes. She led him through the station corridors toward the processing center. And guards nodded at her as she passed, and civilians stepped aside to let them through. And the man walked beside her in silence, never looking away from her. "Stop staring at me," she finally said. "I apologize," he replied. But he did not stop. The processing center was a cold gray room with metal chairs and bright lights, and a single desk where Sarah sat down across from her prisoner. "Name," she said. "Kale." "Full name." "Just Kale." "Place of origin." "I do not remember." "Age." 37. "I think." Sarah typed his answers into the system and watched as the computer searched every database across the 12 human colonies. And one by one, the results came back empty. And the man called Kale sat perfectly still and watched her with that strange expression that she could not read. "You are a ghost," she said finally. And the word felt heavy in her mouth. "I suppose I am. Do you know what we do with ghosts on this station? I imagine you hold them until you can determine if they are dangerous. And then you either release them or you send them to the Arzelian authorities for processing." His voice was calm when he said the word processing. But Sarah saw something flash in his eyes, something hot and angry. And she understood that flash because she felt it herself every time she thought about the aliens who had conquered her people. The Arzelians had arrived 12 years ago with their massive ships and their advanced weapons and their cold logical minds. And humanity had fought back with everything they had. And humanity had lost. Now humans were a servant species, allowed to live and work on their own stations and planets, but always under Arzelian oversight. Always with Arzelian rules. Always with the understanding that they had been beaten and would never rise again. Sarah hated it. And she hated herself for serving the colonial authority that answered to the Arzelians. But she had learned long ago that survival meant swallowing your pride and following orders. The Arzelians do not need to know about every ghost we find, she said quietly, surprising herself. That is generous of you. It is practical, she corrected. And she stood up and gestured for him to follow her to the holding cells. The cell block was empty tonight. And she led him to the last cell in the row and deactivated the energy barrier so he could step inside. And he walked in without complaint and turned to face her through the shimmering blue light. You will stay here until I decide what to do with you, she said. I understand. She turned to leave. But his voice stopped her. You still wear it. Sarah froze. And her hand moved without thinking to the spot beneath her uniform where a pendant hung against her chest. A broken circuitry chip on a thin metal chain. And she had worn it every day for 22 years, and she had never told anyone about it. What did you say? She whispered. And her voice came out strange and thin. The pendant, Cale said. And his gray eyes were soft now, almost gentle. And there was something terribly sad in his face that made her chest feel tight. You still wear it after all these years. How do you know about this? Because I gave it to you, he said. And his voice was barely louder than a breath. Now I gave it to you 22 years ago, on the night the Capitol burned. When you were a scared little girl with blood on her face and fire in her eyes. Sarah stared at him through the barrier. And her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. And memories she had buried deep began to claw their way back to the surface. That is impossible, she said. But her voice shook as she said it. You should remember, Cale said. And he stepped closer to the barrier, and his face was illuminated by the blue light. And suddenly, she could see past the years and the scars and the weariness. You should remember me, Sarah, because I have never forgotten you. And she did remember. She remembered fire and smoke and screaming. She remembered a boy with gray eyes who had pulled her from the rubble and carried her to safety. She remembered his voice telling her to run, and she remembered the crimson and gold of his uniform, the colors of a house that no longer existed, the colors of a family that had been wiped from history. No, she breathed, and she stepped back from the barrier, and her whole world shifted beneath her feet. No, that is not possible. Because the prince died in the bombing. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that he is dead. Everyone knows what the Arzelians wanted them to know, Cale said. And there was fire in his eyes now. The same fire she remembered from that terrible night. A dead prince is harmless. But a living one who has been hiding in the outer colonies and building a resistance for 22 years. He pressed his hand against the barrier. And the light flickered around his fingers. That is very dangerous indeed. The memories came back to Sarah like a flood breaking through a dam. And she stood in front of the holding cell with her back against the cold metal wall and her eyes closed and her mind drowning in images she had spent 22 years trying to forget. She had been 7 years old when the Arzelians came to Nova Terra. The throne world of humanity, the shining jewel of the Terran Empire. The planet where her parents had worked as servants in the great palace of the Solara family. She remembered the day before the attack. And she remembered her mother braiding her hair in their small quarters near the kitchen. And she remembered her father lifting her onto his shoulders so she could see the royal gardens from the window. And she remembered thinking that she was the luckiest girl in the entire galaxy, and then the sky had turned to fire. The Arzelian ships had come without warning, dropping from hyperspace in numbers that blocked out the stars. And their weapons had turned cities to ash in seconds. And their drones had hunted through the streets, killing everyone they found. Sarah remembered running through the palace corridors with her mother's hand gripping her so tight it hurt. And she remembered the ceiling collapsing behind them. And she remembered her mother's hand suddenly going limp. She did not remember what happened next. Not clearly, only fragments and flashes of smoke and heat and the terrible sound of a child screaming. And she had not realized until years later that the screaming child had been her. But she remembered him. She remembered the boy who had appeared out of the fire like some kind of spirit, with ash in his dark hair and blood running down his face and a broken energy blade in his hand that sparked and sputtered with dying power. He could not have been more than 15 years old, but he had moved like a soldier, fast and sure and deadly. And he had cut down 2 Arzelian drones before scooping her up in his arms and running. She remembered being carried through burning hallways, and she remembered the boy's heart pounding against her cheek, and she remembered him whispering words she did not understand, words that sounded like prayers or promises or both. They had reached a service tunnel that led to the city below, and the boy had set her down and knelt in front of her, and his gray eyes had been fierce and bright despite the exhaustion on his face. "What is your name?" he had asked her. "Sarah," she had whispered. "Sarah," he had repeated. And he had smiled, even though there was nothing to smile about. And something about that smile had made her feel less afraid. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, Sarah, because I'm going to tell you something important. And I need you to remember it." She had nodded. "Too scared to speak. Humans do not break," he had said. And his voice had been steady and strong. "No matter what happens tonight, no matter what happens tomorrow, no matter what happens for the rest of your life, you need to remember that we do not break. We survive. We keep going. We find a way." He had reached up and torn something from his own uniform, a small circuitry chip that had been attached to his collar, and he had pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers around it. "Keep this," he had said. "And remember." Then he had pointed her toward the tunnel and told her to run and not look back. And she had run, and she had not looked back. And she had never seen him again, until now Sarah opened her eyes and stared at the man in the holding cell. And she tried to reconcile the ragged ghost in front of her with the fierce boy who had saved her life. And slowly, terribly, the pieces began to fit together. "The uniform you were wearing," she said, and her voice sounded hollow to her own ears. "It was crimson and gold, the colors of House Solaron," Kale confirmed. "But servants did not wear those colors. Only the royal family wore those colors." "That is correct." Sarah shook her head, and she could feel her world cracking around her like glass. And she did not want to believe what she was hearing, because believing it would change everything. "The royal family died in the bombing," she said. And she was repeating words she had heard 1,000 times, words that everyone in the colonies knew, words that had become truth through sheer repetition. King Aldrich and Queen Marin and their son Prince Kale. They all died when the palace fell. The Arzelians confirmed it. They showed the bodies. They proved it. The Arzelians are very good at making people believe what they want them to believe, Kale said. And there was bitterness in his voice now, old and deep. "They killed my parents. That much is true. I watched them die. I could not save them." He paused, and Sarah saw his jaw tighten with an old pain that had never healed. "But I escaped, and I was found by members of the palace guard who had also survived. And they smuggled me off-world before the Arzelians could finish their hunt. And I have been moving through the outer colonies ever since, never staying one place too long, always hiding, always waiting. Waiting for what? For the right moment," Kale said. And his eyes met hers through the barrier, and there was something burning in them now, something that looked like hope and hatred mixed together. "The Arzelians think they conquered humanity. They think they broke us. They think we are nothing more than servants and workers and slaves, too beaten to ever rise again." He stepped closer to the barrier, and his voice dropped low. "They are wrong." "What do you mean?" "I mean that for 22 years I have been doing more than just hiding," Kale said. "I have been building, organizing, connecting, reaching out to every scattered human settlement in the outer systems. Finding the ones who still have fire in their hearts, the ones who remember what we used to be, the ones who refuse to accept that humanity's story is over. Sierra felt something stir in her chest, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. And she recognized it as the same feeling she had felt as a child when a boy with gray eyes had told her that humans do not break. You built a resistance. She breathed. I built an army, Cale corrected. And there was no pride in his voice, only grim determination. Hidden shipyards and asteroid belts where we construct ships the Arzelians know nothing about. Secret academies on forgotten moons where we train soldiers and pilots and engineers. A network of spies and saboteurs in every colony who wait for my signal. How many? Enough, Cale said. Not enough to defeat the Arzelian Empire in open war, not yet. But enough to remind the galaxy that humanity is not dead. Enough to show our people that there is still hope. Enough to strike a blow that will echo across every star system where humans live and work and dream. Sierra looked at the pendant beneath her uniform, and she thought about all the years she had worn it, all the nights she had held it in her hand and wondered about the boy who had given it to her. And she realized that some part of her had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. Why did you come back here? She asked. Why did you come to Meridian 7 after hiding for so long? Because in 3 days an Arzelian commander named Xerath is coming to this station, Cale said. And his voice turned cold as ice. And Xerath is the one who planned the attack on Nova Terra. The one who gave the order to bomb the palace. The one who murdered my parents and your parents and millions of other innocent people. His hands curled into fists at his sides. And I am going to kill him. Sierra stared at him, and she felt the world shifting beneath her feet again. And she knew that the next words out of her mouth would change her life forever. But before she could speak, Cale spoke first. I am not asking you to help me, he said gently. I know you have built a life here. I know you have survived by following the rules. And I would never ask you to throw that away for the sake of an old debt. He reached through the barrier, and even though the energy field sparked against his skin, he held out his hand. But I wanted you to know the truth, Sarah. I wanted you to know that the boy who saved you is still alive, and he has never stopped fighting, and he never will. She looked at his hand, and she looked at his eyes, and she made her choice. Sarah did not take his hand. Not yet, because there were too many questions spinning through her mind, and too many years of careful survival screaming at her to be cautious. She stepped back from the barrier and reached up to touch the pendant beneath her uniform, feeling the familiar shape of the broken circuitry chip against her fingertips. And she tried to think clearly through the storm of emotions crashing inside her. I need to understand, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. I need to understand everything before I decide anything. Cale lowered his hand and nodded, and there was patience in his eyes. The kind of patience that came from waiting 22 years for a moment like this. Ask me anything. How did you survive when everyone else died? How did you escape when the Arzelians were hunting every member of the royal family? Cale leaned against the wall of his cell and crossed his arms. And Sierra could see the weariness in his body now. The exhaustion that came from carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. My father's personal guard was a man named Marcus Cole, Cale began. And when the attack started, he was supposed to get me to a secure bunker beneath the palace where I would be safe. He paused, and something dark passed across his face. But the bunker was already compromised. The Arzelians had known about it somehow. They had agents inside our own government who had given them everything. Every secret, every defense, every plan. Traitors, Sierra whispered. And the word tasted like poison in her mouth. Collaborators, Cale corrected. Humans who decided that their own survival was worth more than the survival of our species. Humans who sold us out for promises of power and protection under the New Order. His voice was bitter, but not surprised, as if he had long ago accepted this particular cruelty. Marcus realized the bunker was a trap, and he changed course. He took me through the servant passages instead, the ones that only the household staff knew about. And that is how I found you. He looked at her, and his gray eyes softened. I was trying to reach the emergency tunnels when I heard a child crying, and I could not leave you there. I could not walk past and let you burn like everything else. You risked your own escape to save a servant's daughter. I risked my own escape to save a human being, Kale said simply. That is what my father taught me. That is what it means to be a Solaran. We do not rule our people from above. We stand beside them. We fight for them. We die for them if we must. Syrah felt something tighten in her throat, and she blinked rapidly to clear the moisture from her eyes. What happened after I ran? Marcus found me, Kale said. He had been searching the palace for survivors, and he pulled me out through the tunnels and got me to a ship before the Ozelians could close the net. And we fled into the outer systems where their control was weakest. And you have been hiding ever since. Hiding and building, Kale confirmed. Marcus taught me everything he knew about warfare and survival. And when he died 5 years ago, I took over the network he had started. And I expanded it, reached out to more and more colonies. Found more and more people who were tired of bowing to alien masters. He pushed himself off the wall and stepped toward the barrier. And Syrah could see the fire burning in his eyes now. The same fire she remembered from that night in the burning palace. Do you know what the Ozelians call us? Yes, Syrah nodded, because every human knew the word. It was spoken in Ozelian council chambers and broadcast on every colonial newsfeed as a reminder of humanity's place in the galaxy. They call us the Broken Ones. The Broken Ones, Kale repeated. And there was something dangerous in his voice now. Something that made Syrah's skin prickle with anticipation. They think we are weak because we feel emotions. They think we are inferior because we act on instinct and passion instead of pure logic. They think we are nothing because we lost one war. He pressed his palm against the barrier, and the energy field crackled and sparked around his fingers. But they do not understand us, Syrah. They do not understand what makes humans different from every other species in this galaxy. What makes us different? Everything, Kale said. And his voice rose with a passion that filled the cold gray room like a fire. We are chaos. We are unpredictable. We are 100 different cultures and 1,000 different beliefs, all fighting and arguing and disagreeing with each other. And somehow, we still find ways to come together when it matters. He pulled his hand back from the barrier and began to pace the small cell like a caged animal. We went to our moon with technology that would make the Ozelians laugh. We split the atom before we even understood what we were doing. We built machines that could think, and networks that spanned continents, and ships that carried us to the stars. And we did all of it while fighting ourselves every step of the way. He stopped pacing and looked at her, and his gray eyes were blazing. The Ozelians think our chaos is weakness, but it is our greatest strength. Because it means we cannot be predicted, we cannot be controlled. We cannot be broken no matter how hard they try. Syrah felt the words sink into her like seeds taking root. And she thought about all the years she had spent following orders and keeping her head down and pretending that this was all life could be. And she felt something inside her beginning to crack open. 3 days, she said quietly. 3 days, Kale confirmed. Commander Zyreth arrives in 3 days for an inspection tour. And I have 47 operatives positioned across this station waiting for my signal. And when the moment comes, we will strike. And then what? And then we disappear back into the outer systems. And word spreads across every colony that an Ozelian commander was killed by human resistance fighters. And people begin to remember that they are not as broken as they were told. He stepped closer to the barrier. and his voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. One spark. Sira, that is all it takes. One spark to light a fire that will spread across the galaxy. One strike to show our people that we can fight back. One moment to remind humanity what we truly are. Sira looked at him. This ghost from her past. This king without a throne. This boy who had saved her life and had spent 22 years fighting a war that no one even knew existed. And she felt the weight of a choice pressing down on her shoulders. She could report him. That was the safe option. That was the smart option. And she would probably be promoted for capturing a dangerous terrorist. And she could go on living her small, careful life in the shadow of the Arzilian Empire. Or she could help him and throw away everything she had built. And risk death or worse for a cause that might not even succeed. She reached up and pulled the pendant from beneath her uniform. And she looked at the broken circuitry chip. And she remembered a boy's voice telling her that humans do not break. What do you need me to do? She asked. Kale smiled. And it was the same smile he had given her 22 years ago in a burning palace. Fierce and bright and full of hope. I need you to disable 3 security checkpoints in the eastern sector, he said. And I need you to feed false patrol data into the system for approximately 6 minutes. And I need you to trust me. Sira took a deep breath and felt the pendant warm against her palm. I trust you, she said. Now tell me the plan. The 3 days passed like a fever dream. And Sira moved through her duties with a calm face while her heart raced with fear and anticipation. She had released Kale from his cell, using a fabricated excuse about mistaken identity. And she had watched him disappear into the crowds of the station like smoke dissolving into air. And she had spent every moment since then preparing for what was to come. The plan was insane. She knew that. It relied on perfect timing and split-second coordination, and the kind of luck that only fools and heroes ever counted on. But she also knew that sometimes insane plans were the only kind that worked on the morning of the 3rd day. Commander Zyrith's ship arrived at Meridian 7. Sira stood at her post near the main docking bay and watched the Arzelian cruiser glide through the station shields. And she felt her stomach twist with a mixture of hatred and fear as the massive vessel settled onto the landing platform. The Arzelians were tall and thin, with skin like pale blue marble and eyes like pools of liquid silver. And they moved with a grace that made humans look clumsy by comparison. And everything about them radiated superiority and cold disdain. Commander Zyrith stepped off the ship surrounded by a dozen guards. And Sira recognized him from the images Kale had shown her. The sharp features, the ceremonial scars that marked him as a war hero. The silver insignia on his chest that proclaimed his rank. This was the creature that had ordered the death of her parents. This was the monster that had burned Nova, Terra, and broken humanity's spirit. This was the target. Sira checked her chronometer and saw that it was 1832 station time, which meant she had 15 minutes before the operation began. And she used those minutes to position herself near the security hub where she could access the system she needed to compromise. At 1840, she received a coded message on her personal device. Just 2 words that made her heart pound. Light rising. It was the signal that all operatives were in position. Sira took a deep breath and began her work. She used her commander access codes to enter the security network. And she navigated to the patrol assignment system. And she began entering false data that would show guards in locations where no guards existed. And she opened gaps in the coverage that would allow Kale's operatives to move unseen. At 1845, she disabled the first checkpoint in the eastern sector, making it look like a routine system glitch. At 1846, she disabled the second checkpoint and the third. And she watched the security grid rearrange itself around phantom patrols that existed only in the computer's memory. At 1847, the world exploded. The first blast came from the northern cargo bay. A massive EMP burst that knocked out every electronic system in a 100-meter radius. And alarms began screaming throughout the station as emergency protocols kicked in. The second blast came from the southern docking ring. Another EMP, followed by a series of smaller explosions that sent smoke and debris billowing through the corridors. The third blast came from directly below Commander Xyrith's position. And Sira watched on the security feeds as the floor buckled and guards scrambled, and chaos erupted everywhere. At once, it was beautiful. The Arzelians were brilliant strategists. Everyone knew that their hive mind coordination and logical planning had conquered 100 worlds and built an empire that spanned half the galaxy. But they had one weakness that they had never been able to overcome. They could not handle chaos. Sira watched as the Arzelian guards tried to respond to the attacks, and she saw them hesitate and falter as reports flooded in from a dozen different locations, each one contradicting the others, each one demanding immediate attention, each one impossible to prioritize using their usual logical frameworks. Humans did not fight like other species. Humans did not line up in neat formations and exchange fire according to predictable patterns. Humans attacked from shadows and disappeared before anyone could respond. Humans sacrificed themselves for strangers and fought to the death for causes that made no logical sense. Humans were chaos made flesh. And the Arzelians had never learned how to fight chaos. On the security feed, Sarah saw a figure moving through the smoke toward Commander Xyrith's position. And even though the image was blurry and distorted, she recognized Kale immediately. He moved like water flowing through cracks, slipping past guards who were too distracted by explosions and alarms to notice one more body in the confusion. And he carried a weapon in his hand that looked like it had been assembled from a dozen different sources. A patchwork of stolen parts and improvised engineering that should not have worked, but somehow did that, was humanity in a single image. Sira thought, broken pieces held together by stubbornness and will, functioning despite every logical reason why they should not. Kale reached the corridor where Xyrith had taken shelter, and Sira watched as he disabled 2 Arzelian guards with quick, precise strikes that spoke of decades of training. And then he was through the door and face to face with the creature that had destroyed everything he loved. The audio feeds were scrambled by the EMP interference, but Sira could read their body language through the flickering video, and she saw Xyrith's silver eyes widen with something that might have been shock or fear as he recognized the face of the prince he had tried to kill 22 years ago. They spoke. She could see their mouths moving, and she wished she could hear what they were saying. What words passed between the hunter and the hunted at the moment of reckoning? Then Kale raised his weapon. Xyrith tried to move, tried to reach for his own sidearm, but he was too slow, too bound by his logical assessment of the situation, too unable to predict what a human would do in this moment. Kale fired. The shot was silent on the scrambled feed, but Sira saw the flash of energy and the way Xyrith's body jerked and crumpled, and she felt something release in her chest that had been clenched tight for 22 years. It was done. She watched Kale stand over the body for a moment, his shoulders rising and falling with heavy breaths. And then he reached down and took something from the commander's uniform, some kind of data device or insignia, and he turned and disappeared back into the chaos. The next 6 minutes were a blur of false alarms and misdirection as Sira covered Kale's escape, feeding bad data into the security system, sending guards to the wrong locations, buying time for the operatives to scatter and vanish. When it was over, when the Arzelians finally restored order and began to assess what had happened, they found 47 different people had been involved in the attack, all of them human. All of them vanished without a trace, and they found their commander dead on the floor with a human weapon lying beside him. Sarah stood at her post as the chaos settled, and she kept her face carefully neutral, even as her heart soared with a fierce, wild joy. She had done it. They had done it. And somewhere out in the station, Disappearing into the crowds like a ghost, the lost king of humanity was already planning his next move. The news spread across the colonies like wildfire, burning through dry grass. And within hours, every human in the galaxy knew what had happened on Meridian 7. Commander Zareth was dead, killed by human resistance fighters in a coordinated attack that had left the Arzelians reeling with confusion and rage. And for the first time in 12 years, humans began to whisper a word they had almost forgotten. Hope Sarah heard the whispers in the corridors of the station as she walked her patrol routes. Heard them in the mess halls and the cargo bays and the cramped living quarters where workers gathered to share rumors and speculation. "Did you hear?" they said. "Did you hear what happened? Did you hear that we actually fought back? They say there were dozens of them," others replied. "Maybe hundreds, all working together, all coordinated perfectly. They say the prince is alive," the boldest ones whispered. "They say the son of King Aldrich survived the bombing and has been building an army for 20 years. Syrah kept her face neutral whenever she heard these whispers. But inside she felt the same fire that she heard in their voices. The same spark of defiance that had been smothered for so long, finally beginning to burn again. The Arzelians tried to contain the story, tried to spin it as an isolated incident by a handful of terrorists who would soon be caught and punished. But the truth was too powerful to be hidden, and the more they tried to suppress it, the faster it spread. On Meridian 7, the rebellion continued in small ways. In ways the Arzelians could not trace or stop. Dock workers began making mistakes that slowed down Arzelian cargo shipments, accidentally dropping containers, misfiling manifests, losing track of inventory in ways that could not quite be. Proven deliberate engineers introduced tiny glitches into the station systems, power fluctuations that inconvenienced the occupiers without causing enough damage to trigger investigation. Guards looked the other way when they should have been watching, forgot to file reports that should have been filed, moved just a little too slowly when responding to calls. It was death by 1,000 cuts. And the Arzelians could not understand why everything on this station had suddenly become so difficult. 3 days after the attack, Syrah found a message waiting for her in her quarters. A simple note with no signature that contained only a time and a location. She went to the cargo bay at the specified hour and found Kale waiting for her in the shadows between storage containers. And he smiled when he saw her. That same fierce, bright smile that she remembered from her childhood. "You did well," he said. "We did well," she corrected. He nodded, accepting the correction, and for a moment they stood in silence. Two survivors of a tragedy that had tried to break them both. "What happens now?" Syrah asked. "Now we build," Kale replied. "We take this spark and we spread it to every colony in the galaxy. We show every human that resistance is possible. We remind our people what we used to be and what we can become again." He reached into his coat and pulled out the data device he had taken from Zareth's body. And Syrah saw that it was glowing with lines of Arzelian text. "This contains Zareth's personal files," Kale explained. "Intelligence reports, troop movements, strategic assessments, everything we need to plan our next strikes. And after that we strike again. And again, and again, until the Arzelians realized that they did not conquer humanity. They only woke it up." He held out his hand to her. And this time Syrah did not hesitate. "Come with me," he said. "I need people I can trust. People who remember what we are fighting for. People who will not stop until humanity is free." Syrah looked at his hand, and she thought about everything she would be leaving behind. Her quarters, her rank, her careful, safe life in the shadow of the occupation. Then she thought about her parents, dead in a burning palace because aliens had decided that humans did not deserve to rule themselves. She thought about the pendant around her neck, the broken chip that a boy had given her as a promise and a reminder. She thought about all the whispers she had heard in the corridors, all the hope that was finally beginning to bloom in the hearts of her people. "Where do we go first?" she asked as she took his hand. "Everywhere," Kale replied, and his gray eyes blazed with the fire of a king who had finally come home. They left his station that night on a cargo freighter bound for the outer colonies, and behind them they left a station that would never be quite the same. A station where humans had remembered what it meant to fight in the months that followed. The rebellion spread like a virus through the Arzelian Empire, popping up on world after world, each attack coordinated with the others, each strike more devastating than the last. The Arzelian High Command convened emergency sessions to discuss what they called the human problem, and their analysts studied the pattern of attacks with growing frustration. Because there was no pattern, because humans did not follow patterns, because every time the Arzelians thought they understood what the Resistance would do next, the Resistance did something completely unexpected. They adapt faster than we can model, one analyst reported. They cooperate across divisions that should be impossible to bridge. They sacrifice themselves for people they have never met. They find hope in situations where hope should not exist. How do we defeat them? A commander demanded. "I do not know," the analyst admitted. "I do not think anyone knows, because they do not fight like any species we have ever encountered. They do not fight to win, they fight to survive. And those are not the same thing." On a small moon in the outer systems, Syrah stood beside Kale and watched a group of young humans training with weapons and tactics. And she felt something swell in her chest that she had not felt in 22 years' pride. These were the children of the conquered, the sons and daughters of the broken generation, but there was nothing broken about them. There was fire in their eyes and steel in their spines and hope in their hearts. And they were ready to fight for something greater than themselves. "We are going to win," she said. And she was surprised to hear how certain her voice sounded. "Maybe," Kale replied. "Maybe not in my lifetime, maybe not in yours, but someday, yes. We are going to win." He turned to look at her, and his gray eyes were soft with a warmth that made her heart ache. "Do you know why I'm so sure?" "Tell me." "Because we are human," he said simply. "And humans never give up. We never stop fighting. We never accept defeat no matter how many times we are knocked down." He reached out and touched the pendant that hung around her neck, the broken chip that had connected them across 22 years and a galaxy of pain. "You kept this all that time," he said. "You held on to hope, even when there was no reason to hope. Even when everyone told you that humanity was finished. You kept believing that something better was possible." He smiled. "And it was the most beautiful thing Syrah had ever seen. That is why we are going to win. Because every human in this galaxy has the same fire inside them, waiting for someone to light it, and now the fire is burning. And nothing in the universe is going to put it out." Syrah looked out at the training ground where the next generation of resistance fighters were learning to be warriors. And she felt the pendant warm against her chest. And she knew in her bones that Kale was right. Humanity had been knocked down, but humanity would rise again. It was what they did, it was what they had always done, and somewhere among the stars, the Arzelians were finally beginning to understand that they had made a terrible mistake when they decided to conquer the one species in the galaxy that simply ref us.